background's in teaching, and I'm going to give you an exam. All right, so you ready? You're all fired up for it? Okay. What I'm going to talk about is learning. There we go, learning. We all have an idea about what it is. Most of us do it every day. That's the old saying. We learn something new every day, and hopefully that's true. But let's find out how much you've learnt about learning along the way. So, we'll start with the exam and make it easy for you. Here's our quiz. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to give you a number of statements, and I'd like you to tell me whether or not you think these statements are true or false. All right, so very simple, true or false. Of course, they're trick questions. You know this is coming, right? First one. Right. We only use 12% of our brain. Did anyone think that one was true, by the way? No? We've seen this one. It's been in the media a lot lately. What about this one? Active learning is better than passive learning. Who thinks that's true? Who thinks it's false? Who's not game to answer? I need 2 volunteers. No, I don't. How's your anxiety level? Okay, that one is true. Okay, that one is true. There we go, true. Press the button really hard. Okay, what about this one? This one always gets a bit of action when we talk about this one. People are generally visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learners. So this is the whole learning styles thing. Who says it's true? Hand? Show of hands. Okay, who says it's false? Oh, for those playing at home on the video up there, it's about 50-50. Not game to answer? Oh, there's a few around there not game to answer. The evidence suggests that this is actually false. Now, a lot of you are probably sitting there thinking, well, you know, I identify myself when I have a preference for learning things visually. No doubt you do. But ultimately what matters here is what we actually tell people to do. And what we tell them to do will guide their behaviour far more than what anything to do with visual, auditory or kinesthetic learners might do. So it's a really interesting mix of the types of tasks people do, the types of preferences that they have, but the point is here that it's actually quite a complex mixture of things that impact on this. So we might think that we have certain preferences, but depending on how we design learning activities, when we're looking at it from an educational point of view, that will tend to drive the way that people learn in those situations more than any of the preferences that they have. And that's part of our job as teachers and part of our job as researchers to figure out what those things might be. So, how do we end up with a whole lot of confusion? All right, why so much confusion? That's why. That bit in your brain's not working properly, or in my brain at least. So, what we've generally had for a very long time in education is this setup where people have these theories, they put those theories into practice, they see whether those theories work. What they figure out while they're doing these things then feeds back into the theory itself. So we have this cycle that we call a kind of praxis thing. Right? So there's nothing wrong with that, not by any stretch. We've learned a lot about how people learn through this process. And in some ways, I think of this, I used to be a chef a long time ago, I think of this as the way that sort of cuisine developed as well. So we've got different ways of thinking about how we might approach cooking, and a lot of that is based on tradition. So people tried things, didn't taste very good, or it did taste good, they fiddled with it, and over time we developed this really advanced and quite complex cuisines throughout the world. A similar sort of thing is starting to happen when we think about learning. So for a very long time, teaching was done in very good ways. We know that these ways work because they've been through iterations of trial and error over centuries and over millennia. But now, we have, you've already seen, new tools to be able to understand what is actually going on when people learn. So that's a functional magnetic resonance imaging image. Okay, you might have seen one of those before. Yes? Anyone had one done? Fun? Noisy? All those things? What this allows us to do is to think differently and find different types of evidence for what we think might be true in terms of learning and what might not be. And certainly if you want to bail me up later on and argue about learning styles, I'm happy to do that. The trick for us, though, is that when we take this sort of evidence that we've got here, it is very hard for us to use an image like this, go out and hand it to a teacher or hand it to you at home when you're trying to learn something informally, and say, this is the best way you should learn. All right, we need to really unpack what's actually going on here, what does it mean, and how can we actually make some sense of it so that it provides something useful for people. So I tend to think of it like this. You know, I'm an academic, we all tend to live on our own islands. We can't just take the neuroscience and apply it directly to education, right? Doesn't work. Right? The other thing that we have to be very careful of, particularly when you're an academic, is trying to get from one island to another. Not very safe. More than once I've been told that working in more than one of these areas is career suicide. Little unsettling. But it is something that we're starting to work on and we're starting to look at a lot more closely so that we can actually unpack what we're learning about the brain and how we might actually be able to use it to enhance our learning. It's something that we're involved in unpacking what it means when we have these kinds of things, and some people have been less than complimentary about some of the stuff that's going on. So, you know, this is one case here, talk about quackery, and it sort of is a similar situation to what happened when medicine started to become a little bit more science-based. Okay? There was kind of a gap between what was being produced in the very core basic biomedical science and the types of things that had developed and evolved in practice, in medical practice over, again, centuries or millennia. The gap that was left between those two things meant that it was unclear what actually had evidence supporting it and what didn't. And that's what we're going to try and figure out. Some people have picked up on the fact that some of the stuff that's being used is not necessarily what it appears to be. The classic example of this is a study where they put a dead salmon in an MRI, and the dead salmon's brain lit up, which was kind of interesting. So there is an element of error in what we do, and there is also an element of inference. So we take an image of somebody's brain and we can see this part's lighting up when they do whatever it might be. We can't just take that and then apply it. We need to make some sort of inference about what that actually means. And some people are prepared to try and do that for us. And there are even less complimentary terms, as you can see there. Neurobollocks. Not being very nice. My colleagues don't play nice sometimes. Okay. One way to sort of sum this approach up is to think of it like this. Looking for learning is like trying to open the bonnet or the hood, if you're from America, of your car and looking for driving in there somewhere. Right? We can't do it. We're talking about a very biological, concrete way of understanding how we learn. It needs to go through multiple layers of translation before we can actually understand and make use of that information. It is very important, but it is also important for us to take into account the socio-cultural context or the context that we might be learning at home. You know, you've got the internet available to you, you've got all sorts of other educational technologies and other ways of sharing information and learning from other people that are not necessarily going to be captured in an MRI. Right? So part of our job is to try and think about what that might look like. That's something that we're doing as part of the Science of Learning Research Centre. You can see there's a whole lot of institutions involved there. We're about a year in. We've got 4 years of funding to try and start this process of translating this hard neuroscience evidence that we've got to something that we can actually give to teachers or that we can disseminate more broadly so that people understand better how they can learn. So you can see there are 3 elements to what we do here. We have classrooms, so these are real-life classrooms. We're also doing things with online classes because we know that a lot of people learn online, particularly in higher education now. Anybody done an online degree program? Okay, so there's been quite a few people. Right, so it's quite common, and we need to understand what's going on in that environment as well, because that's one of the main things that has changed in terms of the ways that we learn nowadays. Right, we have access to the internet, we have access to all sorts of information that makes that learning process either easier or more difficult, depending on which way you want to look at it. There are a lot of people out there who argue that access to this information is actually making us stupid. I'm not sure I buy that. I think it's probably a bit too early to tell whether or not the fact that, you know, if you and I are having an argument in the pub about something, I can Google it immediately and the argument's over. You know, it's very different to what it used to be. We could argue for hours and keep drinking. That doesn't happen anymore, right? So we have a fundamentally different way of relating to information than we have had in the past. So we're looking at school classrooms, we're looking at online environments. These are real live environments that we're investigating. The orange circle in the middle there is about a classroom that we have set up in Melbourne. This classroom, I think the best word to describe it is bristling with technology. It's got cameras, it's got ways of recording psychophysiology, so galvanic skin response, which is how much you sweat, heart rates, all sorts of stuff. So we can look at 25 students at a time. This can be primary school students, high school students, it can be university students. So we're looking at them in this highly monitored environment to try and pick up what's actually happening in that environment while they're learning. The other classroom that we've got is one in Brisbane. This is at the University of Queensland. We can take about 5 students into that classroom, and it's much more a neuroscience-based environment. So this is where we have electroencephalograms, which pick up the electrical activity for anybody who's not familiar with that, and various other tools, again, which we can look at the way that the brain is operating while those students are learning. The important part about this is that we're going to communicate between those 3 environments both ways. So it's not just a case that we're taking neuroscience and saying, well, here's how you need to go and do that. Teacher, off you go. We want that to be a cycle. So we're learning things from the classroom that we're then going to test in the more neuroscience type environment, the more controlled environment, and from that controlled environment, we're then going to translate it back to think about, well, what the teachers might actually be able to use that comes out of that. So that's kind of our plan. And we're partway through that at the moment. Actually start collecting data next week, which will be nice. So what I'd like to do in the last little bit is to actually give you some of the things that we've learnt that do seem to really enhance learning. All right, so these are hopefully the take-homes that you'll get out of this, other than you need to be really good at the changing slides. Right? Okay, exercise. Now, this might seem intuitively obvious. You know, there are lots of old adages out there about, you know, healthy body, healthy mind, and so on. There is some cutting-edge work at the moment, and this is stuff that I heard about myself only a few weeks ago, that is about this notion of neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is quite common when you're young, so parts of your brain will generate new cells and new neurons. But it tends to happen a lot less as you get older. What we're seeing, and a lot of this stuff has been done with rats, that's how new it is. It's very, very early stages in this. What we're seeing with rats is that even when they're older, if they exercise a lot, they have a lot more neurogenesis than they would otherwise. So even rats that are a bit older are actually developing new brain cells and new neurons as a result of the exercise. Now, there are some people talking about whether or not this applies to humans, but most of these processes seem to. So it's early days and we've still got a bit to figure out, but it looks like exercise is one of the most important things. The next one that's important, sleep. Again, this one might seem fairly obvious. Well, I think it's kind of interesting that we really didn't have a good sense of what sleep was for. It's only been in the last decade or so that we're really starting to understand the purpose of sleep from a cognitive sense. What we do know is that sleep's really important for consolidating memory. So it's another aspect of this that I think we have pretty good evidence to say that getting a good night's sleep after you've learned something important, so potentially tonight, don't go to the pub and drink too much, get a good night's sleep so that everything sinks in and it consolidates in your memory. Working hard. This one again might seem to be a little bit obvious, but it's not necessarily the way that we have designed education more broadly. Particularly in higher education, part of it has been about trying to make the process easier for people, but the evidence is actually suggesting that the harder you work, the more you're able to get out of any particular learning situation. Now, what do I mean by that? There are things that we call desirable difficulties. And this is making things actually difficult as part of the learning process, because the metaphor that we have generally had about the brain being kind of like a computer is probably not the most apt one. It's probably a bit more like a muscle. I mean, we're still stuck with using metaphors, of course, but the harder you work it, the harder it is pushed to adapt. And most of the smartest people I know were not necessarily born like that. They've worked really hard. You know, that's how they've ended up where they've been, where they've got to. So that might seem intuitively obvious, but actually difficult learning situations are pretty good for us, and we tend to get a lot out of them. Next. Fail productively. Fail productively. We don't like using the F word, the other one and this one, in education. All right? It tends to bring on a negative connotation to it. I've failed at something. Right? But what we're actually seeing here is, and this is work that's being done out of a lab in Singapore, a lot of this work, is that if we have a go at something and fail dismally at it, what we then have is a situation where we are prepared with a series of questions that we then use to address any intervention that we have after that. So if I have a go at something and then somebody comes along and I fail dismally, and somebody comes along and says, you know, you need to think about this in X, Y, and Z. A lot of the unknown unknowns, to use that horrible Rumsfeld thing, become a bit more known. So when we go into that situation where somebody tries to show us how to do it, we already have those questions there, and what we've found is that people tend to get a lot more out of that situation after that. So failing is actually a good thing from the beginning, with the right instructions set around it and the right kind of scaffolding. Something else, again, that probably seems intuitively obvious, but this one is really important, and there are years and years of evidence to show that this works really well. So the old trick where people use flashcards is a good example of this. It's about testing yourself. Do you actually understand what it is that you're trying to learn? Test it. Put it to the test. You know, flashcards are a great way of doing that if you're trying to remember something, or try and explain it to somebody else. You know, again, might seem intuitively obvious, kind of like the learning styles thing, but in this case, there is a lot of support for this. And the last one I'll leave you with is this one, and it's an important one. We have got evidence out there that when we produce explanations about how people learn in various different situations, we attach an image from a neuroscience study to that, people are far more likely to believe the exact same explanation if it's got some sort of neuroscience pasted over the top of it. So it can be a little bit dangerous, and and even us as scientists can slip into this mindset that, oh, you know, we've got a good study that says somebody's brain does X when we get them to do Y. Well, we need to be a little bit more careful about making sure that that is actually the case, because the translation is quite complex, as I've explained. So I'll leave you with that. If you've got any questions or want to throw virtual tomatoes at me, that's how you can find me. And remember to always make sure that you use the clicker properly. Thank you.
By the time we're 60, more than 90% of us will have known someone close to us who has suffered from some sort of a neurological disorder.
You all know you're not going to live forever. There's only one way into this life and one way out.
I cannot prove to you anymore that anything is possible.
Talk about the marvelous thing that we now understand about our brains.
It gets so much better.